let's get into making some games with Unreal Engine. First, we're going to go through the very basics and just explaining what all your options are with Unreal. So, before we even open the engine, having the Epic Games launcher, you will find you have a Marketplace tab. On this Marketplace, there are hundreds and thousands of assets that you can purchase and use in your own game. Some are animations, some are models, some are particle systems, some are pre-made systems that you can integrate into your own coding, and they range from being very, very small to being absolutely huge. What you're probably more so interested in though is that there's also a free tab where you can get a lot of assets for free use. As you can see, all of the assets that you're seeing here entirely free. This includes a lot of projects that you can use for learning. There's this tab called Quixel Megascans, which are 3D scans of real objects in very, very high detail that you can use. There is the permanently free collection, which is just a bunch of assets that are free to download and use forever. All of the other ones we've had before also are free forever, but there's one little other category, which is free for the month. Every month, this will refresh with 4, 5, or 6 assets, usually adding up to a value of about $300. And if you buy the assets for $0, because as you can see, they're priced all the way to free, they are yours to keep forever. So every month, you should be checking in on the free for the month collection and just get all of them. Because there's literally no downside to having these all. And that will increase your library of usable assets, which will then, for a lot of different projects, be very, very useful to be able to use. And of course, once you get comfortable and good enough with Unreal Engine, you can start making your own assets and selling them on here to actually make some money off of using Unreal Engine. Which gets us into the library tab. Up top here, we have our engine versions. As you can see, I'm using engine 5.1.1, but I've also got 5.2.0 installed. For the series, I'm going to be using 5.1.1. If you're using 5.0 or 5.2 or eventually maybe a 5.3 or 5.4, largely things should still apply the same. At least until there is an eventual Unreal Engine 6, at which point I might make a new series as well. Under that, you see a list of all the projects that you have made and that you're working on. And then at the very bottom, you've got your vault, which is all of the marketplace assets that you own, which also has a search function. So let's say that I want to get my Unreal camera system, which is a marketplace asset that I have made. I simply type in Rail, and then we get the dynamic Unreal's gameplay camera, as well as surface trails, because that has the word rail in it as well, and a Victorian train station and rails. So it's got a pretty decent search engine in there as well. With all that out of the way though, let's launch the engine and make our first project that we're going to be working on. And here we have a selection of templates. You've got a blank template, which I don't think I have ever used this one, but if you're working on a game that doesn't fit within any of these templates, that's the one you would go with, but more often than not, you'll probably end up using one of these. Because if you're making a shooter game, or a walking simulator even, or whatever, a first-person template already exists for you. And that includes a first-person movement, walking around, looking around with your mouse, that kind of stuff. Third person, very similarly, already has movement and a default character set up for you to be using. The top-down is a point-and-click system, so you click somewhere on the screen and the character will move into that direction. And then I've got vehicle, which is things like racing games and stuff like that. I've never really used that too much, so I can't really tell you what that is like. And then we've got a handheld AR and a VR template as well, which, if we're ever going to get into that, that's going to be a series in and of itself. In this series, we're going to be making a simple 3D platforming game. So we're going to start with the third-person templates, where you can then choose whether you want to use Blueprint, which is what we're going to be doing for this series, or C++, which is a little bit more advanced, and I plan on making a more intermediate course aimed at specifically C++ in the future. But for now, we're going to stick with Blueprint. The target platform can be desktop or mobile. We're going to stick with desktop. The quality presets. For the most part, we're going to stick with maximum here. If you're releasing on a bunch of different platforms, maybe you want to be able to use scalable, but for the most part, it doesn't really matter that much. Starter content, that will include a bunch of simple materials and objects that you can use, which are always nice to have. And then ray tracing, we're going to keep off for the time being. And then down here, we can give our project a name. So let's call this Unreal Basics Tutorials. Project name can only be 20 characters or shorter, so we're gonna stick with Unreal Basics Tutorial. And then the project's location, you can put it wherever you want. And then we can create our project. And this is the screen that you will be greeted with when you open up that project. The most important button we're gonna go over first here, and that is this button up here. This will allow you to run the game and test everything out. And as you can see, it's running rather slowly, and that is because it's still building a lot of the materials and shaders and stuff like that in the background while the project has already started up. So give that a moment and it should run a little bit smoother. Then over here on the right hand side, we have the outliner, which is a list of all of the actors. We'll get into what an actor is, but think of it as all the objects that exist inside of this level. So if we just click on this one, the quarter cylinder 11, you can see it highlights it in the viewport, which is what this window of the actual game world is called. That's the viewport. Holding the right mouse button will allow you to look around in the viewport, and then you can fly around in the direction that you're looking with W, A, S, and D. It's very much like controls would be in an actual game, which is very, very nice. So we can go closer to this object and we can see, okay, so that's the object we just selected. If we can't see whatever object we just selected because it's too far away, you can also press the F key and the engine will just get you over to that selected object. Now, you will see this little gizmo over here, these arrows, and that will allow you to move around the selected actor. Very simply like this. You'll also see that in between the arrows, we've got these little corner pieces. If you drag it around by that, it will move it into both of these axes without moving it in the remaining one. If you grab it at the exact center, you can freely move it in all three axes, which generally speaking is not something you really want to do because it's kind of hard to judge distance and location in 3 dimensions at the same time. Coming up here, we can also change that gizmo into a gizmo that allows us to rotate the objects, and it will rotate around the point where the gizmo is, which is the pivot point or the origin point of the object, which can be set in an actor in a number of different ways, or if you're just importing a mesh into your scene, that will have to be set in your modeling tool of choice, something like Blender or Maya or whatever you might be using. So we can use this to rotate this thing around as well in much the same way. As you can see, it's rotating around this bottom left corner. The next one over allows you to scale the objects, again, in any of the axes that you want, in a combination of the axes, or in all three at once. For scaling, using this bottom left one, which selects all three at once, generally is a much more useful one than it was for things like moving this around. And you might have been able to see that these three things have shortcuts. So movement will be enabled when you press W. Then when you press E, it will change to rotation. And when you press R, it will change to scale, which is a little bit confusing because you would assume that rotation is R, but it's not, because these 4 buttons here correspond to the exact same layout on your keyboard, that being Q for the cursor pointer, which I don't often use, to be honest. Then W for movement, E for rotation, and R for scale. And while we're going through all these icons, I might as well cover the rest of them. The next one is whether or not the gizmo applies movement and scale and rotation in world space or in local space. And this might be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around. But as you can see, we can rotate this thing like 50 degrees in some direction, right? And then if we go back to movement, we still move it along the same axis relative to where it is in the world. Then if we change this thing to local position, look at what happens to the gizmo. It lines up with the rotation that we applied to the object. So now it's moving in the world along its local axis, meaning that its rotation now does affect how we're moving things around, which can be very useful, because if we rotate something around and then we just need to nudge it a little bit more in like its own forward direction, this is very useful. Most of the time we do tend to stick with using the world space gizmos though. Then we have surface snapping, which is something that I personally really never use too much, because the next couple of options are snapping things to a grid. So you can see if we go outside here, we have this grid pattern, right? And each one of these little squares over here is what we call 1 unit of distance. And you might have seen before when I was moving things around that things move in a pretty snappy way. And that's because right now it's snapping when it's moved around to every 10 units. So I can set that to every 1 unit. And then you'll see that the movement is a lot more precise. But it's also harder to line things up properly so that they don't clip through each other. I can also set the clipping to something much higher, like 500 units, in which case I can only move them around with every 500 units, which is very useful if your objects are significantly larger. Just pressing this little button over here next to the number will just disable snapping entirely and allow you to move things freely, even more precise than a unit. And the same thing goes for rotation. Usually I like to have my rotation set at a 45-degree angle for snapping. That way I can move it around to 45 degrees and 90 degrees and every 45-degree step around. Scaling, I don't think I need to explain anymore. We can do the same thing for. You will see that it snaps a little bit with the scaling. We can set the scale snap to something like 10 to really show that off. And now you'll see, oh, it only scales up massively right away, which is not necessarily something that we want. And then we've got the camera speed here, which is the speed that the camera moves around in the viewport. If you're working on a very small scale scene, you're gonna want to have this set to a lower number. But if you are working on a massive like cityscape or something like that, setting that to a higher number can be very beneficial. Then we have the very last button over here, which maximizes or restores the viewport. It says it's not really a good explanation of what it does, because what it does is it splits up your viewport into 4 pieces. One that is like the active camera that you're working with, and then we've got a couple of different perspectives as well. So let's focus on this object here, on all the viewports, and you now can see that this is the view from the back, which usually I actually prefer looking at things from the front because it makes a little bit more sense. And then we've got the view from the right, which is from this direction going into there. This can be some useful perspectives, but the most useful one generally is the top perspective, because it allows you to look at things from the top view, especially for lining things up like this. That ends up being very, very useful. And then pressing this button again will maximize it back to being just 1 viewport. If you don't want to split your viewport up into 4, you can do the same thing over here. Going, instead of perspective, we have all the different options here as well. So we can just look at the top from here, find the thing that we're working with, and now we have a full viewport just from the top. You'll also note that we suddenly don't see the textures anymore when we go into one of these, and that's because the thing that's right next to it changes to wireframe. We can set this back to lit, and we just see the level in its entirety. There's a couple of different modes that are useful here as well, like unlit. This is just the basic textures. Let's go back to perspective real quick for that. Without any lighting applied, which can also be very useful if you're working on a very complex scene with a lot of lighting in it that hasn't been baked yet. We'll get into that at some point later. And your computer is having trouble, you can just set it to unlit if you're just moving around some objects and you don't need to worry about what the lighting looks like. And in much the same way, we also have one that only shows the lighting, so everything just becomes blank textures so that you can really look at what does the light actually do. We've got some collision related ones, but usually we stick with lit, unlit, and sometimes wireframe. Those are the three most useful ones. And in much the same way, we have a bunch of viewport options here as well. I'm not going to go into those right now, just take a look through them if you're curious. Like, I can enable the collision, and that will now show the collision around all of these meshes, which is a not unimportant thing to note. For instance, these cylinders over here, they are very round, and there's no real good reason that the collision should be that smooth, because that's only going to take up more computing power. So the collisions for them are actually a lot more rough around the edges, because that's, generally speaking, good enough. And that's the kind of thing that you can see when you enable the show collisions. And in much the same way, all of these other things can be very useful to just take a quick look at. Now, that's a lot of information. I don't expect you to retain all of that right off the bat. I'm just showing you everything so that when it does become relevant, you already know that it exists, and we can go into it a little deeper again at some point in the future. There's two last things that I want to walk you through before we end over this first introductory part to the series, and then next time we're actually going to get into a little bit more detail what actors are and how they work and how you actually build up your games. Before that though, if we have something selected in our outliner over here, which again, remember, these things are called actors, we'll also see that in the details panel over here, we get the, what do you know, details about whatever actor we have selected. So if we select the static mesh cube over here, we can see that the static mesh cube here has a static mesh component. We'll get into components a little bit more in the next part as well. And then there's a bunch of information here to it as well, because every actor needs to have a transform, which is the location and rotation and scale, where it is at in the world, what direction it's facing and how big it is. It's got a mobility mode, which is either static, which is used for things that, generally speaking, aren't supposed to move. It's just an optimization thing for lighting. If it doesn't need to move, you can just apply lighting to it once and then don't need to update it every frame, which saves a lot of computing power. On the other side, we have movable things, which are things that can move around in the game, meaning that if they either emit light or need to be able to have light cast onto them, which pretty much everything needs to be able to have light cast onto it because that's how we see things, that's what you set movable for. Stationary is a kind of in-between. It's things that, as the engine calls it, can be changed but not moved, which is a very cryptic way of explaining it, and it's kind of hard to explain what stationary is actually good for. In a general sense, you can think of it as a slightly better looking but also slightly less optimized version of static. Then this specific actor has a static mesh, which also comes with a material. It has some physics options, collision options, and so on and so forth. We don't need to go through everything that's present here because it's quite a lot. But just know that when I select a different actor in our outliner, which has different properties, such as the directional light, we see that it has different things in the detail panel here. We have the transform because, again, everything needs to have a place inside of the world. But then we have some options for light, such as intensity. If we increase this, we can see the world gets a fair bit lighter. And the light color, which we can make like purple, and everything becomes purple. Because the directional light, which we'll get a little bit more into towards the later parts of this series, where I go into lighting and stuff like that. A directional light is a light that casts from the same direction throughout the entire level. So it's kind of like a sun. And finally, the very last thing that we're going to go into right now is if we come down here to the bottom left corner of the screen, we can see our content drawer. And this is actually where all of our assets live. This is where we can organize them, just like a folder on your Windows or your Mac or your Linux device. I don't even know if you can use Unreal on a Linux device. You probably can. And this template comes with a few different folders pre-set up for us. So we have characters and mannequins, and it's got all the animations in it and the animation blueprints and 2 different mannequins and stuff like that. If we go into the third person folder, we can see a blueprint, and we have the BP third person character. We can drag that into the scene, and we can see it's now in our scene. And this is what our player character is. Now, this won't work as our player character because we have a player start right over here. That's a little bit too needlessly complex to really get into right now today as to why we want to use a start player instead of just putting our player character into the world like this. But this is how we just take assets that we have made or imported and put them into our actual levels, which is a rather important step in making a game, obviously. Next time we're going to go into a little bit more detail about actors, what they are, how they're structured, and how to use them. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.